Now, before I introduce today's speaker, a few words of thanks are in place. This lecture is an annual intellectual joint venture, if you like, supported by the Needham Research Institute, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, the Department on the History and Philosophy of Science, and the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology. We thank the Jing Brand Corporation for their sponsorship of the event, and we are, as always, particularly grateful to the Master and Fellows of Clare College who have hosted this splendid series of lectures here in the Riley Auditorium since their establishment in 2016. Now, this year's speaker requires little or no introduction to most of us. For nearly 6 decades, Professor Jessica Rawson has been a pivotal figure in the study of the material culture of early China. Few scholars have done more to promote visual literacy to an academic field that for a long time approached the study of ancient China predominantly through textual sources. Professor Rawson joined the British Museum in the late 1960s. She was at the museum eventually as keeper of the Department of Oriental Antiquities until 1994. She then served as the first female warden of Merton College, Oxford, where she was also a pro-vice-chancellor in the university and appointed Professor of Chinese Art and Archaeology in 2000. She received the CBE in 1994 and was awarded the title of Dame in 2002 for services to Oriental Studies. Yes, back then one could still use this term. Now, amongst Jessica's many honors, allow me to mention 2. In 2017, she was awarded the Charles Lang Freer Medal by the Smithsonian Museum in recognition of her lifetime's contribution to the study of Chinese art and archaeology. More recently, in 2022, she received the Tang Prize in Sinology. And not only was Professor Rawson the first archaeologist and art historian to receive this award, which arguably is sort of equivalent to a Nobel Prize for China scholars, but she was also the first woman to be awarded it. Professor Rawson's list of publications is long and continuing. Many of us will have been introduced to the art and archaeology of China through the many monographs and catalogues that she published with the British Museum and the many exhibitions that she curated. Her most recent book, and here it is, Life and Afterlife in Ancient China, is fresh from the press this summer. So we are truly delighted to have Professor Rawson with us here tonight to deliver the Needham Memorial Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Jessica for her lecture, which is entitled Finding China's Present in the Past.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roel. It is, in fact, an enormous pleasure to be in Cambridge. I was here as an undergraduate 60 years ago. And so this is home, but I have to come just occasionally to check in to make sure it's still there. And it is a great honour and privilege to give the memorial lecture for Joseph Needham. When I was an undergraduate here, I was already committed to learning about China, but my school had told me that I would do no good by learning Chinese. I wasn't any good at Latin, and so I wouldn't make headway in a language that anyway nobody spoke. And oh dear, well, this was apparently the attitude in the 50s or 60s. So instead I went to dig in Jerusalem, which is in present trouble, but it wasn't then in Jordan, and I learned about a very dry and large, enormous archaeological site under Kathleen Kenyon. And I went there for 3 years, and then I turned to China. And when I went to China, I discovered it was humid. So it just showed how little I did know about China. And I think when talking about Joseph Needham, who was a very big figure in my life as an undergraduate, I think perhaps he too suffered from the same problem, that China is an enormous country with an enormous history, which is very hard for Westerners to understand. And I think at an end of a long lifetime talking about China, trying to explain China, that is where I stand. China is a very large country with many regions, very difficult to understand, and nobody round about us, round about me, usually does want to know about China. So it is a pleasure here to talk about China and talk about it as I have seen it now through writing about this book. The book is about tombs, and you will hear a bit about tombs, and to think about the China that I have visited on the ground, because perhaps the biggest enlightenment of all was for me to walk around China, and of course, in many occasions, with Mei Jianjun, the director of the Institute, because together we realized that it was hard to understand, it was an enormous place, and if we didn't start walking, we wouldn't understand what we were seeing. So I will begin with a slide which shows a site that I went to with Mei Jianjun in 2006. And this was, in fact, one of the wake-up calls. I realized I didn't understand what I was looking at. This is a tomb, and it is 13.5 meters deep. And in England, you are not allowed to dig below 1.5 meters without shuttering. This is 13.5 meters deep, and it's still standing fine. You can see a tiny bit of shuttering, if you like, of bamboo poles, but otherwise, this is a tomb of a major aristocrat of the leading royal family, and its long ramps show that he was highly regarded, very wealthy, and he observed the full ancestor offerings to his own forebears. And this is a key element of China often overlooked. These are not just museum objects to be placed one by one in a case. They are, in fact, a set for offering complex banquets to the dead. And he was going to continue in his afterlife to continue those offerings. So that all looked quite straightforward, except why could they build tombs 13.5 meters deep? You have to think about that. But this isn't straightforward, and this also came out of this tomb. This is a reconstruction of the gold. All this is gold. Part of it is obviously a belt. Part of it, there's a scabbard. There are wrist rings. There's a thumb ring for shooting, for bows and arrows. Now, I didn't know then, but there are no gold mines in northern China. And one has to be completely sure that you know that they aren't there, because where did he get it from? Big question. He also had a set of step-type knives with iron blades. This is the first example of iron weaponry in China in the 8th century. And then I fell for the beads. The beads seemed to me enormously attractive, but Chinese do not normally wear beads, and they don't normally have red beads. There is a little tradition for a few hundred years of red beads, but actually, I spent the next few years trying to understand where the beads come from. And at the end I will explain, but those of you who know about beads know that the origin of such red beads, they are carnelian, that is a specially treated agate, comes from Gujarat. They move into Mesopotamia, and then they transit across to China. So they are a very important feature of China at this moment, but why was this man blessed with these things? Well, it turned out, I thought, as I wrote this book, that if we don't know about the geography of Eurasia, we don't know what we're looking at. And China is here, and it has an enormous plain for crop growing, but actually it has quite a lot of mountains, and it's on the edge of a large desert. But the key feature, and the one that nobody ever talks about, is Tibet. This is the pivot of the whole of Eurasia. Because of this huge plateau, very high, 4,000, 5,000 high in meters, people cannot and did not, in the ancient times, walk across it. And one of the features, too, that has sort of slipped by, but people used to say, of course, everybody developed agriculture, they built cities, they created states, they found metallurgy, they wrote and developed script. But this isn't actually the case. The majority of these features are developed here in Upper Mesopotamia, and they travel east and West in a sort of contagion. People love to get new information. So the methods of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the creation of metalwork, all went north up here to us and as far as here. But once you get to this region, you cannot set out 2,000 kilometers across the Tibetan Plateau because you need to travel with animals, so both the people and the animals must be to a large degree acclimatized to altitude. And in fact, nobody did walk, and nowadays you haven't heard of many people hiking across Tibet. It's quite, you would need a visa anyway, but I mean, there are other problems now, but crossing Tibet isn't part of the deal. So there is in fact a whole lot of routes, and lots of people call these the Silk Road or the Steppe Road. Again, a certain amount of optimism goes on. When people write about it, they don't seem to know that these mountains are themselves very high, and if you travel across the steppe this way, you're going to have to cross the Altai Sanan, and that is the size of France. Then you meet the Gobi Desert, and you'll only get to China slowly. So that we're going to talk about those towards the end, but China relies on, if you like, people coming, but actually it's quite happy without them. China's culture, as I have discovered and written about, is on the whole completely independent of activity over here. And it's over thousands of years that people do bring herded animals, do bring metallurgy to China. But it's slow. Metallurgy and herded animals are sort of 8,000, 6,000 BC over here. They hit China at 3,000 and 2,000. So we're talking about a long time. This is Tibet. This is the wall of Tibet in the east, overlooking Sichuan province, and this is what the plateau looks like in the winter. And the other most important feature is, though we don't feel it, all of us in this part live on the same diet of roasted animals and wheat and barley. Over here, I'm afraid that isn't on. This is an area in the summer monsoon. So in the summer monsoon, that's why it's so wet, and they grow rice on a huge scale, and they don't have herded animals on any scale, so dairy is not important within this line. Here is the difficult area, and here, crossing up here out of India proves to be very difficult. So this area is by and large arid. It's possible to grow crops, but not many, and this is the area of pastoralism. I'm not going to talk about nomads, but when I say pastoralism, you could also write nomads in the side. That's a slightly rude way of describing a very sophisticated way of life. So I have found it very enlightening to talk to a colleague in my own college, Merton, who works on the Mediterranean. And in case those of you who are from the West feel it a little more secure, you can in fact see that the Mediterranean and China have almost nothing in common geographically. China has an enormous plain, but then you rise quite quickly into 1,000 meters and more, and this is effectively a wall. You are not going to go this way fast. In the Mediterranean, by contrast, there's no great agricultural plain like this. There's a lot of rocky stuff around a sea, and this is the source of this kind of limited activity on land, but huge activity on the sea. So that the Mediterranean turns out to be a very different enterprise from anything you see in China, where the sea is relatively less important. It becomes important from 1000 AD, and perhaps its late arrival, the sea's late arrival on the stage of China's activities, may explain why the South China Sea Islands have become a little controversial. They are a discovery of the sea, but this is discovered and the Atlantic follows. So when we look at this structure, we see a very different enterprise in which agriculture matters above everything else, and where trade, as we think about it, is much less important. These cities, on the other hand, around the Mediterranean, are relatively small, have no large hinterland of crops, and depend for their funding and riches on sea trade. So that we have a completely different history out here in the West, having developed anyway in Anatolia and Iran and Mesopotamia, the herded animals, the metallurgy, and in due course we'll come to the alphabetic languages. But before we finish the geography, geography is my first point that is really, without geography, China is unintelligible. You must notice this. This is, I think, fascinating area. It looks like this and is a huge deposit of sand. In fact, it's much finer than sand. It's wind-blown sand from the Gobi Desert, but also from the edge of Tibet, from the mountains up here, and it's gone on for hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions. And at this area around Xi'an, it's 200 meters deep. So it's not very difficult to dig deep tombs. And as silt, it's flowed out over this whole plain as layers of silt-based earth. So we are in a geographical area that is incredibly different from anything that we recognize, either in Britain or in France. There is loess in Germany. It's completely different from even large areas of America, even though there is some loess. It's just much deeper. Now, when you cut into it, or when you start to terrace it, as here, you can create vertical sides. So, and this is a photograph taken by me some years ago in quite a southern area of the Loess region. This, you can see both the natural erosion and the deliberate human cutting of the ground. This is why the Yellow River is yellow, and this is the Loess area, of course. And here shows you that it's stable. They could build large cave houses into the Loess. So those have now begun to disappear, but when I was first a young scholar going to China, I was thrilled to see them from the train as you drive along through northern China. So this Loess area goes from the borders of the steppe, if you like, right across the whole of the Yellow River and all its tributaries and the whole plain. So we're looking at a geological phenomenon with which we are completely unfamiliar. And it's both this geography and the geology that I'm now going to turn to the second part of my talk, which is why China is different. And it is strikingly different for all sorts of reasons, but first and foremost, the Loess does a lot. Here, we're looking at architecture. If we go to the Mediterranean, we will find plenty of nice Greek temples with stone. But you don't find almost any architecture of stone in China. Why? Because the Loess is covering all the rocks. It's several tens of meters deep everywhere and hundreds of meters deep in the west. So what happens is there's an enormous industry. It's very easy to build in Loess. It's pounded between planks, and you form strong platforms which bind together well. And here you see in the Forbidden City a typical platform. Don't just ignore the stone. It's only fancy dress. The platform is made of earth, and in most cases, Loess. And so there's a huge tradition in China of building on platforms with wood. So if you build in wood in China, you can also make all the parts for these buildings in a workshop. You do not have to do it on site. You very carefully plan it together, you measure it all beautifully, and because they're large cantilevers, here and here, all the way around, this is very carefully worked out in the workshop and can be installed quickly on the site. So this is a very efficient way of building and is unique to China, but then spreads to Korea and Japan. So now, when I mention Korea and Japan, it's worth thinking that the whole area from Tibet eastwards is in fact drawn into forget the northern part, the bit with the cropping area is drawn into the same culture, and they all use the same types of building. And it continues down to today. And one rather sad result is that China itself does not have a long tradition of stone architecture, and therefore does not have a real tradition of concrete architecture. Our concrete architecture is developed from our stone architecture, and they've taken it over, copying it from America or from here, but it's not actually indigenous to China at all. The other thing they can do is build tombs. And so China sets out right in the early Neolithic to build large tombs. And here you have, this is one of the first dynasties who build large tombs. This is 1200 BC. And here you see the guys who've done some of the work, and they can open it up and it's not going to fall in. And one reason is it has a degree of calcium or calcite in among this loess sand, and it remains vertical in its own weight, if you like. The huge weight of this material is keeping it upright, and it's also a dry region. Now, getting out of the way perhaps, I'm showing you that the depth of this sort of tomb is the height of 4 stories of a building. So this is an enormous piece of engineering. Again, something that all archaeologists know what this is like. None of them ever write about it. There's plenty of very good writing about the loess based on geologists. The only articles I've been able to find that are really good are geologists, but archaeologists don't notice, and they don't think about the enormous, if you like, work, the labor that has gone into this, and the engineering and the calculation of that it'll work. And this is where the bronze vessels come in. And I've said that China doesn't have metallurgy. Well, one reason is that the ores are not available if you are standing on a sand pit. I mean, if you're standing on castles of sand, you're not going to see the copper or the tin underneath, though it may be there. So the idea of making bronze, I will show, comes from the West, but what they make is what we saw at the very beginning. They make sets of banqueting vessels, vessels for offering food and wine or alcohol to their ancestors. They do this in life, and then they carry on afterlife, so it goes into the tomb so that the person in the tomb can continue his ritual performance, his ritual offerings to the dead, to his fellows, his relatives that have joined him in the afterlife. This is a much later tomb. I show it to you just for fun. It's not an essential part of my argument, but it's a big tomb. This is a marquis, someone with a title in southern China. And you can see that he's built, actually cut into the rock. So southern China is much damper, has huge rivers, and so there's much less freestanding walls. The loess isn't available. And by now, a very complicated arrangement has been put in. This is this bell set here. There are 65 perfectly tuned bells on which you can play music. These are the ritual vessels for offering to the ancestors. This is the man's coffin, and this is his inner coffin. He's accompanied by 8 women and a dog, and he has another 13 women here and a set of armor. And this is the instrument. The tomb is famous not just for the bells, but the bells are a unique item. It should be known to everybody in the whole world. It's as important as anything in Tutankhamun's tomb. But he also has zithers and pipes and drums, and they're tuned to the Western pentatonic scale, and he also has a set of chimes that shows us how that tuning is worked out. So this is an amazing contraption, and it's amazing that it's buried. It's buried because he needs it in the afterlife. And so until you accept that the afterlife is an essential part of Chinese life, you're going to find understanding China very difficult. And I think this is one reason why Westerners need to take a deep breath and think this is something we haven't met before, and it would be useful if we thought more about it. And it has a modern side, because here, this is the built bronze set again. These are bronzes from the British Museum, which I walked around all the time, thought about. There's a lot of discussion of how they're made, the motifs on them, why they're important, but above all, they're important for banqueting. Over here is a figure made by a completely different technique of lost wax, and it's a figure who is undoubtedly some sort of deity. So we're looking at not just 2 different casting systems, we're looking at 2 different belief systems and belief paradigms. So the people in the East are looking at the belief that the ancestor continues to be active in their living lives while after death. This is a very important feature of all early China, and it continues to be important much longer and much later. So don't think it's gone away, it's still there with us now. This is a completely different system to one in which you have a deity who is worshipped by a given community. And in a minute, I'm going to say that what we're looking at on the eastern side of Tibet, it applies to Japan and Korea as well, we're looking at a family-based ritual and belief system. And in the West, and this includes everywhere from Iran to Ireland, we're looking at a community-based belief system which has leading individuals within a religious framework, if you like. So it applies to Islam, it applies to Christianity, to Judaism, and to Buddhism. And so in some ways, the West is the odd one out. The ancestor and the family structure will be found in other continents among other people. And I show this with an example I'm familiar with. This is Merton. This is Merton College, and here is the chapel with everybody singing at a service, and the leader will, of course, be the chaplain, who is behind me. You can't see him, but in the meantime, everybody is equal. Here, this is Korea, and this is China, and this is the offerings made of food to nourish the dead, to nourish the ancestors, and to show them respect, and to indicate their inclusion within the family. And the most important thing is this inclusion within the family. But it goes much deeper than that. And if you go back to these inscriptions that Roel mentioned, here we have a bronze of around 1000 BC, perhaps, with its inscription inside still complete. And this is a perfectly viable translation by a colleague. And it says that 2 kings, one after the other, succeeded in power to the throne of China under the Zhou dynasty, and the people who are relatives or attendants of those kings should show respect to them and follow the leadership of these kings. So even around 1000 BC, the notion of a hereditary ruler and the importance of adherence and concern for them after death has become a very important feature of China. But it remains today. And I think one of the things we're omitting when we don't seem to get along with understanding how we can get China to acknowledge universal values is they're working to a perfectly good but different system. And it is the pyramidical system of the family. The family in China has an absolute view that the son cannot replace his father. He cannot, in the lineage, he will remain on the list below his father, whether he might take his place at rituals, but in the sequence of generations, he will remain the son and not the father. So what you find in China is an enormously prevalent hierarchy. You cannot do anything in China without acknowledging that hierarchy in all aspects of daily life. Every one of us who has tried to negotiate anything, to visit a place, to talk to anybody, to meet a high-ranking archaeologist, has had to work out who the senior people are who are needed to facilitate that. A foreigner cannot just walk in. And one of the problems that West is making is to see China as a land in which you can walk in and play around with. You cannot. And dinner will tell you all. This is the dinner table. This is the dinner table. Every one of us who's had a foreigner who has had to try to negotiate and is taken to dinner will be greeted by this possible plan. However, they won't tell you what the plan is. You will be enter the room and they say, take a seat. Aha. You mustn't take a seat. The host will take this seat facing the door and the next host there. And the guest of honor will sit there. Do you know who's the guest of honor? Or are you the second guest of honor? You must work this out and quickly edge towards a position where you don't make a mistake. They will help you, and it will gradually become clear. But it takes a bit of working out if you're a foreigner. If you're Chinese, it's instinctive. They don't have a minute of problem. They walk straight into the right seat, sit down and talk. But I've gone with Oxford Dons, Oxford academics, to China. They're completely adrift when it comes to dinner, and they will not follow my suggestions. I say, just take it carefully, go in slowly and work out who is in charge. It's very important to work out who is in charge, and so on. And the most important thing is you shouldn't be there if you can't recognize who's in charge. But anyway, this is simply the simplest and easiest explanation of why I think we should pay attention to this very strong hierarchy, which has its basis in the family, ritual, and belief system. Oh dear, we mustn't lose that. So I've just gathered together. The other thing is to look at the tiered cities. I don't know how Cambridge would feel if we said it wasn't even making the fifth tier, it's probably the sixth or seventh tier. And is Birmingham, or where is Birmingham? Is it in the second tier? Should it be in the first tier? Who gets into the first tier? Is it Edinburgh? Who knows? So that they think and talk about the tiered system of cities all the time. And when you turn to this piece, which I've known long, is in the British Museum, it describes how this piece of lacquer was made, and then it tells you who did it. And you can see at once that it's in the factory workshops of the Shu prefecture. It's under the government right away. And then it has a list of people who are in charge. But right at the bottom, please note, in charge were government head supervisor Zhang, chief administrator Liang, his deputy Feng, their subordinates, executive officer, etc. So in other words, in making lacquer, this is ordinary, quite beautiful, but ordinary lacquer drinking cup. The whole thing is in a hierarchy, and it's under administration. Now, the one feature of China that holds it all together, and I think is the key to why it's such a strong country, is its script. To those of us who have to learn the characters, it takes a bit of time. Children, too, take a bit of time. But once you know the characters, you can read whatever is written all over China, and you can read the past. This is an oracle bone, a bronze inscription, and this is the one behind me, is an inscription by the first emperor inscribed on mountains to announce his great achievements and how everybody must pay attention to them. And even given my lack of skill in this, I could actually sit down and turn those into modern characters. It would not be very difficult. So most people don't spend time on this, but it's an enormous strength. So the whole of the past is laid out in a language everybody can read today, and every region, though they speak dialects and interests quite differently, they will all write and read these characters. So that as a unification instrument, it is unrivaled. And don't listen to anybody who says it's a waste of time to learn Chinese. It is the main instrument in holding China together, providing a government that is united, and also providing a literature and philosophy, belief system, and opportunities that are all easily known. So China is enormous. It's got many different regions. Every region is different with food and dialect, customs, history. But with this single language, they are united. And it is a quite extraordinary phenomenon. Because if you go to Sicily, which is tiny, my colleague who told me all about the Mediterranean just showed me what was all used, all the different languages used in Sicily over a few hundred years. So this shows you the polyglot language mess-up that we go in for, and the problems. You heard recently, the French are not at all pleased to be told that everything in all business for the EU must be carried out in English. So think about this lot. Should it be Greek? Should it be Oscan? What is Oscan? What about Punic? So this is just Sicily. And the same is true of coinage. So the difference between our coins and those of the Mediterranean are enormous. They have gold and silver. China starts out with imitation chariot fittings. These are chariot tools in the very first coins. And then somebody's told them that coins should be round, but they're made by casting. And this is a very complicated piece of casting where you can cast a whole set all at once. So China doesn't do things by halves. Once they decide to have round coins, they have round coins. But they don't ever put a head on it. They tell you the value of the coin, but they don't tell you much more. So the coins are very enigmatic. Now, if we turn to figures, and I think here we become to a really difficult question. This is a figure of the deceased with a name of the artist and of the dead man, and this is an image intended to be something of a likeness. So when we see the terracotta warriors, what are we seeing? Is that an image of people who were there, or is it something else? What are they doing here anyway? And I think that it was the terracotta warriors, which I don't like very much, which has woken me up to some of the really interpretive difficulties which China offers us. And probably rather like the family and the hierarchy versus the community with a leader, the problem about the social structure in China, this idea about what an image does and what it is for is overwhelmingly different from the West. So here we have the coffin I showed you before, and it's undoubtedly the case that the coffin in the afterlife is a house with a door and a window. And the essential feature of the items buried in tombs is that they are properly prepared with proper features for the use of the dead in his afterlife. So he's also going to be guarded. These are guardians, and there are a lot of snakes and other demons around here to be kept out of the way. So that the coffin is already a very complicated set of images, which is moving from being images to being a kind of reality. And that is actually the case of the terracotta warriors. That warriors are not images of past armies, they are creation of a future army. The army is placed around the tomb for the defense of the emperor in his afterlife. And unless we really try to take that in, the terracotta warriors are meaningless. So they're very carefully prepared. They have obviously been worked out in extreme detail to mirror the army of life. And this is a charioteer with a particular hat. These are guys from one region with particular hairstyle, and these are with caps, so from another region. So that the army reflects the kind of army that the people could have gathered together to work for the emperor. So if I now turn to, I've spent a lot of time struggling with these ideas, but if I turn to a story about the 7th to 8th century, I show you how they can flip in the minds of those who make these tombs and their contents between two existences. So a man is traveling along a short road to meet up with some mates and do some project. And it's getting late and getting dark, so he decides that the local inn that he's just passing would be a good place to stay. And he knocks on the door, he goes in, and they give him a bedroom, and he starts to go to sleep. But he's very quickly woken up. The innkeeper says, there's some people from the neighborhood who need your help. There's a skirmish going on, and we need all the people out to help the fight. So he joins a small skirmish and fight with a group of armored men, and both the innkeeper and his friends and the man we're talking about are successful. And that's fine. Evening over, he goes back to bed, and in the morning he gets up and leaves to join his colleagues. As he goes along, they're coming towards him in a slight hurry and looking a bit peeved. And they say, where have you been and why are you late? And he said, well, it's just this way. I was late, so I stayed in this inn, and then I got involved in a local sort of bust-up, and then I had to go to bed again, and now I'm here, so don't worry. And they said, no, look, there is no inn and there is no village. Where have you been? What have you been doing? What have you been up to? And he said, well, I'm completely clear that I stayed in an inn, and I was involved in this little skirmish. So they said, all right, take us to it. So they'd go back along the road, and they find what he thought was a village was a cemetery. And when they looked closely at the cemetery, they found that one of the tombs was a bit disturbed, and lying on top of the tomb were some beheaded figures in armor. So in life, they are tomb figures. In afterlife, they're figures who will fight. So this is a switching around of what is real and what is not real that we don't find at all familiar. So I just leave you with this thought. I've thought about it a lot, and I'm absolutely convinced that unless you accept that the coffin is a real house and the figures are the army, you will not find China easy to understand. Now, this is an amazing tomb, and it's not my favorite tomb. I love these big loess pits, really, but here it's laid out in a very complicated way, and the terracotta army is here, there's some bronze birds there, there's a ritual structure, there are a lot of people killed who had been workmen working on the tomb, and this is the tomb. It's inside walls as if it's a city. So the first thing to remember is this, as we move, if you like, to the third section, is that it's not possible to view the terracotta warriors without recognizing that they had a plan. And China has an enormous capacity for planning large projects. This is not something strange. They are better at it in the ancient world than almost anybody but the Romans. I think the only competitor is the Romans, or a few pyramid builders, but this goes back, right back to long before this writing. So when we look at China today, I think we should never forget that China is capable of enormous plans and in carrying them out. And this is the size of the tomb. It's actually 100 feet deep and 100 feet above. It's enormous. It's the size of a 20-story tower block, and it's not been excavated, but this is judged by remote sensing and by coring, by drilling into the ground and sending a deep core in and looking at what you find. And it has an enormous stone surround. So this is the first sign that China is at this time in contact with the Afghanistan area and the Hellenistic world. So what the emperor has done is to call on everybody around him, particularly from the east, from all the states he's conquered, but also from the Hellenistic world. So I just want to emphasize that in all periods in China, they could make a plan. And in all periods, they could carry it out for big infrastructure. So this is a Neolithic site. It's near Shanghai. It's one of the very early important cities, if you like. And this is an excavation of the wall. But this is the width of the wall. It's not the length of the wall. So this is an enormous wall between 30 and 40 meters wide, and then several kilometers long. So that's a large project in itself. Then if you look at the area, this is an area that is only a few meters above the sea, and they are getting water from these high-level canals, and they're creating dams to fill a pool of clear water, because if you live in this terrible danger of the sea coming in, having some good clear water for rice growing is a good idea. And here is I just slipped again, but this is a picture of the dam, and the dam is made of sandbags. If you can see the sandbags, they are made of grass, of a kind of reed, and they're filled with the local mud. They're stacked up, and the length is 50 meters, and the height is at least 10 meters. And they made many of these dams, and you don't do all this without a plan, because if you don't get it right, the water here falls down into the valley in a way you don't want. So this is a well-planned, well-organized scheme, and an enormously important site where jade is dominant, in fact. So this, I jump to something else that is extremely complicated. This is a silk weaving outfit where we would have had a machine, and we learnt how to do this kind of weaving from the Chinese, and we developed a punch card system to decide how to pull up these. But the little boy does it all here. So he also knows exactly what to do. If he gets it wrong, this is very fine silk weaving, he'll be pushed out of a job immediately, no dinner. So we have as well as large infrastructure, we have extraordinary complex machinery already. This is a machine for making the finest textiles in the world. I'm not, the silk, of course, is the cocoons of the mulberry grub, if you like, who eats the mulberry leaves. And then there we have the porcelain industry. And when the Jesuit priest, Père d'Entrecol, in the early 18th century, went to the very biggest kiln for making porcelain, he noticed that every pot went through the hands of 70 people. In other words, the work had been divided out between 70 people. That's also to make the porcelain, and then to paint it, and then to pack it, and ship it to England. So these both are wrecks. This is a wreck, a relatively early wreck, found near Vietnam, but this is white porcelain. This is blue and white porcelain, and we all have white porcelain dishes in our canteens. Why do we have white dishes in our canteens? Because they're imitating China. So this is one of the amazingly influential products. And Jingdezhen, where this is made, it's the Staffordshire of China, certainly had people who could make kilns. They could run this enormous project, and they could follow requests from Britain or Denmark or Japan and ship it all out. So this is an incredible example of huge export and great technique, because this has to be fired at a high temperature. There has to be control of kilns that can do this. It's an astonishing achievement. We take it for granted. We all know Chinese porcelain, but the Germans and the French and the British spent an enormous long time and never quite made as good porcelain. And so this is a quite exceptional skill, and they didn't realize that the majority of the technology is based on grinding granite. This porcelain is made from grinding granite, and then in due course, to make bigger plates, they added what we call kaolin, which is from the Gaoling, the high ridge where the clay comes from. So there's clay mixed with this is probably mainly stone, this is clay and stone together. And today we've seen, well, this is the Grand Canal. It's just as important as the Terracotta Warriors. And here are the railways. And if you've ever traveled on a Chinese high-speed railway, you don't understand why in England we can't even build 50 kilometers. This is more kilometers of fast railway than all the rest of the world put together. So, and that is a plan. So before we start to think about China's issues with us, just remember they make fantastic plans, and if they want to, they can carry them out. They do not always want to, and there are large parts of China where there are many ecological and infrastructural problems, there are enormous domestic, physical problems, but when they want to do it, they do it. And the railway is certainly fantastic. Now, I come last to the people I was talking about, the man who has the gold belt, the beads, and here is his tomb. And this is where I think there's another mistaken assumption that you can get to China quite easily on what they call the Silk Road. I'm not sure what they mean by the Silk Road. Usually they tend to think they're going along the foothills of the Tian Shan here. This is a desert, and it's not easy at all. And going through here, you have to cross these mountains. If you come along the steppe, you're going to cross the mountains before you come south. And what was essential is the two parts of the either side of Tibet are doing different things. So this is early West. This is Anatolia and the Balkans, and they make the first metals. And here in China, you get the first jades, and actually they start right up here on the Amur, and they travel down the sea to Vietnam. So the two completely different crafts are the jewelries and sometimes the weapons or the symbolic weapons of early people in the two parts of Eurasia. But they got across this. So this is the Altai, and Mei Jianjun and I went to the Altai, and we found it was rather cold, even in September. We went to see if one could get through the Altai to Siberia. but it didn't look the best route, I have to say. We got very cold, and we couldn't even wash because the towels wouldn't dry in the little hotel we stayed in. I've never forgotten this experience, but every time I've flown over it, and this is me flying over the Altai, I take photographs. To me, it's the center of the world, and if our politicians would kind of relax a bit and go and see the Altai, they might understand why life is more complicated than they think. And this is Mongolia. This is the calm part of Mongolia with the grasslands. And I went there with Martin Jones, and I was very happy to look at my feet all the time because he was identifying the plants that we were seeing on the ground. And it isn't just grass, it's a whole range of different plants. And the inhabitants, the pastoralists, are well able to manage those plants as part of their livelihoods. So, and what I would say that we have always underestimated, I haven't talked about it a lot, but my efforts with Jianjun to go to these places, we also went to Mongolia together and to South Siberia. My efforts to do that is to see how one can understand the geopolitical system that China finds itself in. Because today and yesterday, the nearest outsiders or northerners were in the borders of the Loess Plateau. People moving out of the difficulty, because it's very cold in winter in the steppe, moved into the Loess Plateau. But the Loess Plateau, as you remember, is covered in sand. And how would you, they've not got a GIS, they haven't got a map. They don't know how they're going to get to China. Do they know China's there? Does China know they're there? Those are questions that go through my mind all the time. I think both sides don't know, and this lies between them. So the metals come this way. They come from the west. They cross here, or they cross through the Altai. They come down here, the Hershey Corridor. What do they meet? The jades. So the two cultures meet in 2500 BC approximately, and they have to accommodate, but the jades never make it north. And the metal, when it comes in, is adapted immediately for Chinese practices. So though China takes on a lot from the north, everything it takes, it adapts for Chinese culture. Chinese culture has evolved so far that it's not going to go back to being like the Altai. And here you have a nice map that shows this is the hot pot for early metal. The Balkans and the Black Sea comes here across in the north. It does not go through Tibet. You're not going to walk through Tibet, and you end up here in the Yellow River. And this map is a quick glimpse to show you that you ain't got the ores. This is the area of the Loess, and you can see there are no mines for the ores. So in fact, the ores have to come from the Yangtze River. That's the biggest source of copper. And the consequence of this is that making bronze in China becomes a big and carefully worked out industry. It is not just one man with a son, an assistant in a workshop as we might imagine it today. It is absolutely a large industry already by 1200 BC because they're making these sacred vessels for the offerings to the ancestors. So everything is pushing China into large-scale activity which has to be worked out both technically and in planning. And very quickly you realize that though you have these vessels in the middle bit, this is where the Shang dynasty is in the yellow with the red cities. If you look again, you see that the people in the north are not really doing that. They're making something else. So the neighbors of the northern neighbors don't have a lot of metal, and they're making weapons. The southern neighbors have a much greater access to metal, and they're making vessels, bells, animals, and so on. So that actually the Loess Plateau is determining the degree of metallurgy that people are going to be allowed to have. It's nature that is telling them where you can get the metals. So in this debate or enterprise, we must not forget the northerners. The northerners become increasingly rich and increasingly powerful, and this is a site most people think they've never heard of. It's Arjan II, and it's in South Siberia. It's in the Sian next to the Altai, and there are two guys, the man and his spouse, and he's dressed in gold. This is what it looks like. These are lots of kurgans in the middle of a valley in this mountainous region. And what is going to happen is the people in this mountainous region up here are going to meet up with these people. And so there's a very important period in the pre-Qin period when there's communication between Arjan in the Altai Sayan and Yuhuangmiao, which is here in the mountains on the edge of Peking. And you can see it here. This is the man. This is the man dressed up in his lovely gold stuff. He's got a great gold belt. He's got various scabbards with gold-hilted iron. He's got a mace, and he's got a huge torque, and his hat is decorated in animals. He is completely unfamiliar, unknown to the people around Beijing, but somebody told the people around Beijing, who are definitely animal herders, they've got horse heads in their tombs, and that they make a copy of the same belt. So this is the belt, and this is the copy of it, made in bronze near Beijing. The man has a bronze knife, and a bronze dagger and a bronze knife, and he's copying here the pair of weapons that this man has, which are in iron with gold, and these are very smart. They're much bigger, much stronger. So the strong people at this moment are the people in the South Siberia, in the Altai Sayan, and the offshoot, if you like, moving in towards the central China, but not into central China, are people in the south called Yuhuangmiao, which is a little way north of Peking. It's not very far. And I'm not going to talk at length about horses, but of course the horse is vitally important. This is a little snapshot I got of a charming boy who looked with great alarm at a group of academics from Oxford and from Peking, and he wondered what they were all doing on his riding place, which was the remains of a great city built in the 8th century by the Uyghurs at Karabalgas. So up here is the Sayan, and this is where we met him on one of these trips I made with a whole group of people, but of course with Jian Jun. And here is the area which people have to cross to get for those weapons to reach Beijing. So this is an important dialogue on which I've spent a lot of time, and perhaps I started there, but what I have come to see is unless we understand and recognize the power of these people on the North China Plain, above all, and their ability to control this borderland, if we don't recognize it, we won't understand the relationship between these two different partners. And it is a partnership. The whole range of technologies has reached China through this semi-desert and across these huge mountains. Horses, chariots, metallurgy, the herds of sheep and goats, all that has come this way and has engaged with the mobile pastoralists en route. So that throughout Chinese history, this area is never actually drawn into China, but it remains the most important partner in a dialogue. And here you see the horses buried in a tomb right in the center of eastern China, but they've taken up the stones from the borderland, they've taken up the horses, so China's become indebted to the technologies of these much less, if you like, I think it's wrong to say they're less sophisticated, but certainly not as settled as the Central Chinese. So this is one of the world's most important dialogues, and again, most people are oblivious to it, but this tells you why it's important today. This dialogue remains essential to both Putin and Xi Jinping. And if you aren't conscious of the long history of this dialogue, you don't understand why Xi Jinping must be a close friend of Putin. Here is the gas, and here is the copper. This is in Mongolia, but the copper has traveled underneath China's huge mountains and loess, and it's easier to get at in the Gobi Desert. It's not very easy. This is an immensely deep mine. But my long walks with Mei Zhenjun through the steppe area, through the mountains, has made me realize that we must take this seriously. This is the key relationship of China. It has to have a relation with the northerners, and it has a whole range of different relations over a long period. I haven't taken you into the post-Qin period, which is completely different, and it changes again when the Westerners travel by sea, first the Islamic groups and merchants, and then the Westerners. But unless you take this seriously, unless you look at this long history, you don't recognize that this is part of the life of China. China doesn't live without this contact and managed contact with the North. And the Russians are just as conscious of it, and the Mongolians also. And it's not necessarily comfortable for anybody, but it is an essential part of the geopolitical framework of the whole of the world. So, if we look back at what I've said there are at least two quite different regions, and we're a bit too obsessed with the Mediterranean, but it goes all the way to Iran. Iran is part of our world as much as the Mediterranean, and that's why we're having the present trouble that we're having. China is a very different part, and it's really important to recognize that it is culturally independent. It is not possible to say that they developed farming or metallurgy because everybody does. They developed them in their own way after they'd made contact with people crossing this area. And this area has its own dynamic and works in a completely different way from these two. It's still very different. The few times I've traveled in eastern Russia, if you like, in the Siberia, particularly in the winter, when it's very hard, you realize you're in a different world where even though the inhabitants speak Russian and look like me and are Europeans, their whole attitude to distance, space, and the past is quite unlike Western Europe. So that though we read about all this being Russia, right up to this area, it's a different Europe, a different kind of Russia to the Western Russia. So it is easier, I think, to understand our present geopolitical problems if we accept that we have these three different regions with different cultures, different ways of life, and above all, different climates. The climate is overwhelmingly important, and now that we're upsetting it with climate change, it will just get more exaggerated. So I end with the map again. I think China is independent, and it benefits hugely from these routes, but the routes that are described as the Silk Road are oversimplifying what is happening. This is an immensely complicated set of transits, and later on in two directions, beginning very much west to east, partly because the animals are domesticated in northern Mesopotamia, and they move with people, not by themselves, they move with people into areas originally occupied by hunters. So this area was occupied by hunters, but it gains the pastoralists, who are very skillful managers of animals and of landscape. So never believe that it's easy to cross this land. Major Jun and I found it quite hard going, actually. We went up by car up the Altai from here, and it goes steeply up like that, but actually it's quite slow if you come up from the Siberian side. So it's an interesting place, and I still don't understand how people made their way in this enormous landscape with enormous mountains, with rivers that freeze in the winter. You can travel on them in the winter, but they're huge, huge rivers. And the Yenisei, which I think is this one, perhaps it's this one, is on the two sides of it is low on the western steppe and high on the eastern steppe. The eastern steppe is between 1,000 and 2,000 meters high. It's very, very cold in the winter and very warm in the summer. So don't worry about going there. It's wonderful, beautiful, but at the moment, no visas. And this, I'm not going to talk anymore, but this is the Silk Road. And it has a different aspect, but it's above all a desert. This is the desert. These are rocky mountains. They're stunning in appearance. And here is the Tian Shan, the Silk Road often is thought to go at the foot of the Tian Shan. The Tian Shan are the heavenly mountains or the mountains in the sky. I think it's better to think of Tian as the sky. These are the mountains in the sky, taken by me one day, very near the extreme western end of the Xinjiang province and very near Kashgar and Kazakhstan. And they rise to 7,000 meters. So nothing is on a small scale. And I think that while we live in Britain, we are living in a miniature world very different from this. So I end there, but that's what I've learnt. But there's more to discover still. Thank you. Thank you. I don't need that much.
Jessica, thank you very much for such a rich tour de force, really, where both scale but also diversity was very prominent in your presentation. Now we do have some time for questions. There is a microphone here, and Genjun, there's a microphone on your side, and so we will serve you with a microphone. I was wondering, Jessica, whilst you sort of find your energy back over a glass of water, whether I could ask you to reflect on something that is not puzzled me, but it fascinates me as a historian of China. That is that when we talk about China, when we read about China, the discourse is always about continuities from the deep past until the present, or its unity. Political unity. Well, there are geographic. The train station, yes. The railway station, the script, of course. If you talk about the Chinese script, is a unifying factor. Now, obviously, as an archaeologist, and just looking at the slides you showed today, there is a lot of diversity. As a matter of fact, you could say, like, so where do we find China amongst all these diverse objects? And I'm wondering how you, as an archaeologist, sort of deal with the tension. On the one hand, we do seem to still be talking about this China as some kind of monolithic, civilization that progresses,
continuously,
over centuries. But on the other hand, the evidence obviously is questioning it.
Questioning it. Yes. I think I go to that map where it's the other side of Tibet. So anything the other side of Tibet, I think, is in East Asia. And then I think the problem, what I think is puzzling a lot of my archaeological friends in Oxford is, why do the Chinese not migrate and settle beyond the lowest plateau, in Inner Mongolia and above all in Mongolia? The answer is, you cannot run all the year round farming in those areas, and there's no possibility of farming rice. You can farm millet, and Martin had the wonderful explanation that if you put down a yurt, a tent, and you live in it all through the winter, and then you lift it and move off to summer pasture, the ground is still warm enough to plant millet. And you plant millet, and 45 or so days you come back and harvest it. So you can plant millet, but you cannot run Chinese agriculture. What I think I learned by going on my feet, and I think the most important thing is to go through all these different places, is that everything at all periods was diverse. I think what I talked about, the ancestral cult and the tombs, they're all different in every region. And I think every group of people had their own version of their beliefs. The only thing that I think is that they did believe, and truly believed, and still believe, in the power of the ancestors to affect the lives of the living. And I think if we don't understand that, we're not going anywhere. But at the same time, the enthusiasm that many of us feel for China is because each region is different, each food is different. The jades come from one area, the gold comes from the steppe. All these different things make it a rich experience. And I think one has to accept it is a rich experience, rather like Europe is, but it has got this grip on itself with the characters.
Questions, comments, and we can also encourage our students to speak up.
Well, Julia's raised her hand.
Thank you, Jin. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that extraordinary lecture. I wanted to ask a question. Oh, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Perfect. Wanted to ask a question which piggybacks a bit on Rule's question just now. So in China today, there's a lot of talk about and sponsorship of research into what's called Chinese civilization. What it is, when it can be said to have started. And my question for you is, to you as someone who's so familiar with the material traces of people who've lived for thousands of years in the landmass, which we now call China. So for you, at what historical moment does something that can be recognizably called Chinese civilization, to coin a phrase, when does that emerge? And for you, what were the key characteristics of that thing called Chinese civilization, which is so widely talked about in China today? What would those key characteristics be?
I'm afraid that they don't ask my opinion, so we're probably not, and probably a bit of divergence from me and what's going on. What I would say is I think in China, food is terribly important, and I think anywhere in the burial tradition where you find this huge emphasis on food, I think you're starting to see what I recognize as China. And that turns up in the late Neolithic, when you get a lot of ceramics. So I certainly think by the time you have characters that you're in China, whether you like it or not. And at the same time, I think it's probably going to be difficult for the Chinese authorities to recognize that when you do have characters, all the same, not everybody writes, not everybody reads, and there will have been languages right in the south of China, which is now very much part of China, where people thought and did very different things. So the bit I'd ask the Chinese authorities is, to what degree are you tolerant with the gradual accumulation of a sort of Chineseness? Because it's a very slow process. It works much better in the south. The south is a rich area, and you see the tomb structures, the ancestral rituals, the food, the rice cultivation, and also the complex technologies moving south. You do not see them moving extremely far north. So I would say it's where you see, I've given you 4 points, and 3 of them are really the way of life, the mass production, and the ability to absorb things from the north without overwhelming it. I think all those define what I see as Chineseness. Each of us has to make our way as a foreigner. We are foreigners. We will never be anything else. And as you make your way in a foreigner, you have, in a way, to learn, and each of us learns in a different way. And it's not an easy walk, and I am grateful that I started on it so young. My first book was given me by my mother in 1954, which described a travel of 2 boys from Beijing across Mongolia to Urumqi, to Xinjiang. So I don't think all of us will ever have the same picture of China. This is my picture. There's no reason why anybody else should share it. And the Chinese government might like my view that Chinese culture is independent, but there are lots of other things they won't like. So each of us will have to make our own way. And it's a forest, and that, like crossing the lowest plateau, there are not many guidelines. Nobody told me about the dinner seating plan.
I'm very timid about speaking at all on this. Is this working?
Yes, yes.
It is. It was a fascinating tour you've given us. What I'm struggling with is trying to understand today's China versus the West's world. I went to China quite early, not by your standards, but in 1980. And I've been more recently where they asked me endlessly, well, what do we have to do to be creative technologically And of course, the answer to that is in the West, as we have seen it, and I've lived my life equally in the States and here, is to give a lot of independence to people, not ask them to be uniform, but to ask them to be different. And they look at me in a very puzzled way. And Xi Jinping's been talking about this just recently, that he really doesn't think it's good to give companies independence. You really need to guide your nation as a whole. So I'm still struggling to...
I would stop struggling. The most important thing about China is give in. It is China. It's not the West. And if you don't accept it as it is, you won't get anywhere. I think China is absolutely outstanding in these technological plans. If you can make 8,000 terracotta warriors of the same size in the correct ornament, correct armor, you're doing pretty brilliantly. I'm not sure that what the recipe is for creativity in the sciences. I have to say, I think it is something that only a few people have. I was very fortunate when I went to Taiwan to get my prize to stand next to the two people who got the Nobel Prize for the mRNA vaccine science. And I met there people who I have ever very rarely met anywhere else. One is a Hungarian, as you know, and one is American. And both of them are working for an idea. I think, of course, they're independent, but what they have, and what one sees too rarely, is the belief in what they think, they believe in it, and they're persistent, and they're working for the world. And I think they were rare in my experience in Oxford of scientists, and I was overwhelmed by their impressive behavior and their clear sense of direction. So what does the West have? I think it should value the past. It should value Copernicus, Darwin. I've been reading about Humboldt. I think these people are fascinating, but they did things in an era which was different from today. And I think you have to want to follow a line. So the Hungarian, Katalin Karikó, thought about mRNA about the age when I thought about China. I think if you don't have that drive, you won't be as creative. So I think it's something to do with discovering an idea and following it. I don't think China is less individual or independent than we are. Every Chinese I've ever met is different from every other one. They're not all the same by a long way. I mean, they're quite obstinately different. And so I don't know that it's about, we talk about freedom, we talk about universal values. I think it's more complicated. I think if Xi Jinping and China want to develop brilliant science, they need to think about what is important and where to put individuals, if you like, who really can do it. I mean, you have to gamble. University Penn did not gamble on Karikó, as you know. They demoted her, she went and left and worked for BioNTech. Without Karikó, there would be no mRNA science. She's the one who roped in Drew Weissman. So it seems to me it's a complicated business, and you need to, as a head of a university, as a head of a faculty, you need, unfortunately, to track people, look and see who is inventive, and then help them do what they want to do. In some ways, being told the whole time by my superiors that China was a waste of time made me work harder. So I think there's a degree of being obstinate that helps, but I'm not sure it's got to do with the Chinese society, because they have landed on the moon, they built the railways, they built the terracotta warriors. There's very little they can't do if they want to do it. I know that there's Copernicus and Galileo and Darwin are all Westerners, but that doesn't matter. They're benefiting. What I think the Chinese, I've had a run-in with a group of senior Chinese when they said Europe was a waste of time. I said, well, quite a lot of things were developed in Europe. And they said, you're a colonialist, you see. So I think this is a political problem, which I would leave them to rest on. Let's not worry.
We've got a question from Chris.
1, 2, 3, yes. Thank you very much, Jessica. I take it I'm audible, am I?
Yes,
Good.
very.
Thank you very much for this very rich panorama that you've shown us, which brings back my experiences as a little boy of 11 getting on the train from Bedford to go to the British Museum and the Science Museum as well. I was oscillated between the two. It's a wonderful conspectus of the glorious things that an archaeologist can find and can learn from them in East Asia and indeed in the other parts of the world that you've referred to. And it occurred to me as I listened, when you talked about things like they are very good at planning, they are very good at marshalling vast numbers of people to make the terracotta warriors and so on. I thought about the fact this plays in a little bit, doesn't it? This they, these are the people whose property we see largely when we, if I may use that phrase, or archaeologists do archaeology. That's what you find. You find the remains of the powerful people, the elite and so on. Pardon me, I don't want to sound as if I have a chip on my shoulder, but I'm the first member of my particular family to escape from being the people who they told what to do, who they organized and so on. And I'm not sure, perhaps we need to, when we look at these diagrams of hierarchical organizations in China, including, I noticed, the Chinese Communist Party, and we think of these things as being a natural thing for China, I wonder if there are not people in China, perhaps young graduates coming on the job market at the moment, who might not actually see that kind of society and the dominance of this they on top of them as being entirely natural. And whether we can recover from the past the ways that ordinary Chinese people, the ones who they told what to do, thought and acted, and perhaps we might see the world a little differently if we were looking at it from the bottom up rather than from the top down. I don't know, as an archaeologist, whether your materials allow you to speculate on that, but I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you.
Well, I think it's most important not to have a chip on your shoulder for starters. I'm afraid the elite matter, and in China more than anywhere else. One of the things I think you should do is recognize and take seriously the ancestor cult. The poor, as well as the rich, believe in the importance of their ancestors in influencing their lives. And it's my experience in talking to a wide range of people, and I wouldn't dare talk to the elite about this, that have found this a very important factor. So I would say that you need to look at things that are never looked at, like what is good and what is bad in China, what is auspicious and what is not auspicious. China spends a lot of time on those two questions, and at all levels of society, and I'm sure you're fully aware of it, as all the images on doors of the poorest households show you. So I'm afraid I don't think, I do think you would see a lot, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the poor in archaeology. It's a huge amount of problematical material, basically because in the Shang dynasty in particular, they were offered in sacrifices. So, but the attendants in a tomb are not sacrifices. They are attendants who will accompany the Lord into the afterlife. And I think for the Westerner, I think it's much better not to worry about things that you're concerned about politically, but to get your mind around the fact that the way they think is definitely not the way I think. And I think the most important thing I can do is to recognize that I do not know how the Chinese think. And if I go on thinking that I do, I am going to be in trouble. So I would say, read about the ancestor cult, look at the huge distribution of tombs, cemeteries, huge numbers of good and evil things, and above all, what is auspicious. The auspiciousness and the search for happiness and auspiciousness is prevalent across all parties in China, and I don't understand how this has been developed. That's for the next generation to work out.
I'm very conscious of time. We will have one more question, please, or comment.
Thank you. And thanks, Jessica. Thanks so much for your talk. And I think it's really good opportunity for me to learn the archaeology in China from a different perspective, especially in a comparative perspective. Because I'm Chinese. I grew up in China, and I moved here for study. I can feel the cultural differences. And I kind of feel like the cultural differences is kind of because of the way people live and how they produce the food. So can I ask a question about how can you relate the cultural differences, if you like, between ancient China and let's say ancient Mediterranean region with the way people grow their food, produce their food, like the agriculture or pastoralisms, the plants they grow and the animals raised, and how this can be related to the religions and hierarchies,
well,
if you like.
Before getting carried away to the whole of society, I didn't go into it in detail, but I showed you the map, which shows that there are 2 different climates involved. And in the West, we grow wheat and barley, and we have herded animals, and we have what I'd call mixed agriculture and herding. And every one of us who's grown up in England, high or low, will have seen cows and sheep and wheat. And what we do is we eat bread, and in early periods that bread was very hard. And we roasted meat or boiled the meat. In China, the rain falls at a different time, as I said, and the crops are completely different. They are millet and rice. And those are not roasted, they're not ground into bread, they're not roasted, they are made into different kinds of congee or different kinds of sometimes dried millet, perhaps, but it's basically a hot food. There is very little use of beef or mutton until later periods, until recently. Pork and chicken are the dominant meats, and a lot of soybeans, a lot of beans of different kinds, and above all, they eat them hot or eat cooked food, and we will quite readily eat cold food. So when I say to my Shanghai-based students, well, let's go and sit in the garden and have a salad lunch, they say no. We don't eat cold food, and we don't sit in the garden to eat lunch. So why? Because it's hot in Shanghai and there's a lot of insects. So that the whole food system is in fact different, and I think the boiling and cooking system is very important. I've never met a Chinese who thought our food was even remotely possible. That they, on the whole, think Chinese food is overwhelmingly better. And I do think it's a dividing line that's worth looking at. And Raoul is the first person and best person to talk about food. So next time you talk to him, not
Well, I think this is a good moment, in proceedings where we could relieve Jessica, from continuing, sort of to cross the Taklamaklan here in front of us. Thank you very much for that. There is an afterlife to this lecture in the true spirit of Jessica's book, and that afterlife comes in the form of free drinks in the garden room upstairs, to which you are all invited, but not before we thank Jessica for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.